There is a fire burning at the edge of recorded history. Not a metaphor, not a symbol, an actual fire in an actual city on an actual night in September of 1666. And for 4 days, it consumed everything. 73 churches, 13,000 homes, the ancient heart of one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the Western world. Gone. Reduced to ash and smouldering rubble in less than 100 hours. We were taught that London burned and then London rebuilt. A simple story, a tragic story, yes, but also a triumphant one. Christopher Wren stepped in with his genius, and a new city rose from the ashes. Clean lines, rational planning, a modern capital fit for a modern empire. That is the story they tell in schools. That is the story carved into monuments. That is the story most people carry with them their entire lives without ever once questioning it. But what if the fire was not the beginning of something new? What if it was the erasure of something old? What if the London that burned in 1666 was not the London that had always been there, but rather a city built on top of something far older, far stranger, and far more difficult to explain? What if the buildings that went up after the fire were built not to restore what was there, but to replace it, to hide it, to overwrite it? You are listening to something that has been buried for a long time. Not just the history in this story, but the kind of thinking that asks these questions at all. The kind that refuses to let an official narrative sit undisturbed. The kind that keeps pulling the thread even when the thread leads somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere without a clean resolution, somewhere that opens more questions than it closes. That is not a failure. That is the point. Somewhere, right now, there are 8 million people walking over buried rivers in a city built on top of things older than anyone who built it understood. And most of them will never think to ask why. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? That is the question this story is going to sit with. Not the fire. The fire is easy. The fire is documented, dated, verified. What is not documented, what has been quietly buried under centuries of official narrative and architectural renovation and convenient redefinition of what counts as original, is what came before it. Because here is what the textbooks skim over. London, before 1666, was not a medieval city in the way we usually picture medieval cities. It was not a warren of crooked streets and humble timber frames that had grown organically from some modest Anglo-Saxon fishing village. It was something else, something older, something that the people who lived there did not fully understand, even as they walked through it every day. Something that the people who rebuilt it after the fire made very deliberate choices not to restore. Go back far enough. Before the fire, before the plague years, before the Tudors and the Stuarts and the Civil Wars. Go back to the London that existed before anyone who currently holds power had any interest in explaining it. There was a river. The Thames is the reason London exists at all, but there were other rivers too. The Fleet, the Walbrook, the Effra, the Tyburn. Rivers that ran through London for thousands of years and that were, beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, systematically covered over, buried, built upon, made invisible. Today you can walk above them without knowing they are there. You can stand in a London street with a river flowing 6 feet below your shoes and feel nothing. That is a deliberate act, not an accident of urban development, a choice. Someone decided that those rivers should not be seen. Now, why would you bury a river? The simple answer is sanitation. The rivers became sewers. That is the sanitation answer, and it is true as far as it goes. But it does not go very far, because rivers had been becoming sewers in London for centuries, before anyone actually covered them up. You do not bury a river because it smells. You bury a river because you want what is on the riverbank to disappear. And what was on those riverbanks? Structures, old ones. Structures that predated the Norman conquest, that predated the Roman occupation, that predated, in some cases, any written record that anyone in the British Isles has ever been able to produce. Structures made of stone in ways that should not have been possible, given what we believe about the people who supposedly built them. Structures with proportions and alignments and interior geometries that echoed things found on the other side of the planet, in civilizations we claim had no contact with each other. This is the thread we are going to pull. Not because pulling it gives us a clean answer. It does not. It gives us a tangle of questions that official history has never been willing to sit with. So let us begin with the fire itself, not to linger there, but to understand what it actually destroyed. The 2nd of September, 1666, a Sunday, 3 in the morning, a bakery on Pudding Lane. The baker had apparently not properly extinguished his ovens before going to sleep. A spark, dry timber, an extraordinarily dry summer had left the city like a matchbook. The wind was strong from the east, and the fire caught. By Monday morning, it had already consumed several city blocks. By Tuesday, it was a beast. By Wednesday, the stone of St. Paul's Cathedral was exploding from the heat, and molten lead from the roof was running down the street in rivers, pooling in the gutters, hardening into strange pale shapes. The London that burned was not simply medieval. The bones of the city were Roman. Literally, the Romans had called it Londinium, and they had built it. And when they left, the city did not collapse and wait for the Saxons to restart it from scratch. Things remained. Foundations, roads, the astonishing walls. The Roman walls of London were still standing, still largely intact, in 1666. Parts of them are still standing now, but the Romans did not build London from nothing either. That is the part that gets very quietly set aside in most histories. The Romans arrived in Britain in 43 AD. But the Thames crossing that became the centre of the city was already a meeting point, already significant, already in ways that the Romans apparently recognized and chose to use rather than replace a place of power. What was there before the Romans? Celtic settlements. That is the standard answer. But even the Celts were not the first. Archaeologists digging beneath London have found things that do not fit neatly into any conventional timeline. Bronze Age artifacts at depths suggesting continuous habitation for 4,000 years or more. Neolithic tools in the Thames mud. Ritual deposits, objects placed intentionally in water or earth as offerings, going back to times when no civilization we recognize was supposed to be doing anything disorganized in Britain. There is a word for the kind of archaeological evidence that does not fit the accepted story. That word is anomalous, and London produces a remarkable quantity of anomalous material for a city whose history we supposedly know quite well. Let us talk about the walls. The Roman walls of London enclosed roughly 300 acres on the north bank of the Thames. The wall was about 3 miles in circumference. It was made of ragstone, a greyish limestone from Kent, bound with courses of Roman brick, and it stood in places upward of 20 feet high. When the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, the walls stayed. And here is what is remarkable. The walls stayed not just for decades or a century, but for roughly 1,000 years after the Roman departure. Those walls remained the defining boundary of what people meant when they said London. The medieval city sat inside Roman walls. You paid different taxes, depending on whether you lived inside or outside. The law was different inside the walls. The walls were not a ruin. They were, all the way up to the Tudor period, an active primary civic boundary. That is extraordinary. No other city in Northern Europe preserved Roman infrastructure at that scale and at that level of functional significance. For that length of time, why did the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the Plantagenets, why did all of them accept and maintain and govern from within boundaries set by a civilization that had been gone for 1,000 years? The usual answer is pragmatism. The walls were defensive. It was easier to use what was there than to build new ones. And that is true, as far as it goes. But here is another possibility. What if the walls were not Roman? What if the Romans found walls when they arrived, used them, incorporated them, added to them, and then got credit for them when the people who had built the original structures were no longer around to say otherwise? This is not a fringe hypothesis invented to be provocative. There is genuine archaeological debate about the origins of certain megalithic and proto-urban structures across Britain. The question of what was in Britain before Rome is genuinely open in ways that popular histories do not reflect. The Druids were systematically destroyed by Roman military campaigns. The island of Mona, modern Anglesey in Wales, was the primary Druidic stronghold, and the Roman destruction of it was described by Tacitus in terms suggesting deliberate cultural erasure, not merely military objective. When you destroy the people who remember, you get to write the story of what was there. Now let us add another layer. The city that burned in 1666 was full of structures and institutions whose origins were obscure even to the people who used them. St. Paul's Cathedral, the one that burned, was not the first St. Paul's. There had been a cathedral on Ludgate Hill since at least 604 AD. The site itself was already significant before the Christians built there. There is a persistent tradition, repeated by Geoffrey of Monmouth and others, that Ludgate Hill was the site of a temple to Diana, the Roman goddess of the moon, before the Christians arrived. The dig under Wren's new cathedral confirmed something extraordinary. When Wren excavated the burned foundations to lay new ones, his workers found an enormous quantity of ox skulls beneath the medieval and Saxon foundations, not scattered randomly, arranged, stacked, concentrated in a deliberate pattern. Wren himself, a sophisticated and educated man, recorded this in his writings. He could not explain it within any Christian framework. He noted that it resembled animal sacrifice at pagan temple sites. What he had found was evidence of something very old and very deliberate beneath the foundations of one of the most important Christian sites in England. He kept digging. Roman material, Roman inscriptions, Roman altar fragments, and beneath those, something older still, something without clear attribution, that his workers simply described as the old work and moved past as quickly as possible because there was a cathedral to build. What was the old work? We do not know. It was buried under the new foundations, covered over, made inaccessible, in the process of building what we now call one of the masterpieces of English architecture. The truth was literally entombed beneath Christopher Wren's genius. That is the pattern. That is the thing that repeats. Something old exists. Something happens. Something new is built on top. And the old thing is not preserved. It is sealed beneath, made invisible. We call that progress. But there is another word for it. Now let us pull the thread in a direction that might seem to have nothing to do with London at all. Let us talk about what was happening on the other side of the world in the centuries before 1666. Specifically, let us talk about the Americas, about the cities and civilizations that existed in North America before European contact. Because here is what most people do not know. There were cities, real ones, large ones, complex ones, not villages, not camps. Cities with populations that rivaled contemporary European capitals. Cities with planned layouts, monumental architecture, and trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles. The most famous of these, to those who know about it at all, is Cahokia, just across the Mississippi River from what is now St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak, roughly between 1000 and 1200 AD, Cahokia had a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people, possibly more. Its central mound, Monk's Mound, is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, a massive earthwork, built over generations, that still exists today, that you can still climb, that still imposes on the landscape in a way that is genuinely difficult to process. And most Americans have never heard of it. That is not an accident. That is a choice. The Mississippian culture, of which Cahokia was the apex, built hundreds of mound complexes across the eastern half of North America, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Tens of thousands of mounds, serving various purposes, built by a civilization that was doing things in earthworks engineering that we still do not fully understand. When European settlers encountered these mounds in the 18th and 19th centuries, the question of who built them became a cultural flashpoint, because a significant portion of the European American population refused to accept that their native ancestors built them. They invented a lost race of mound builders, a vanished civilization of white or non-Indian people who had built the mounds before, being displaced by the ancestors of the Native Americans currently in the way of westward expansion. This myth was not marginal, it was mainstream. It was used, explicitly and without apology, to justify the seizure of native lands. The argument went that if the real builders of the mounds were gone, the land had no rightful indigenous owners and was available for appropriation. Archaeology eventually demolished this argument. The mound builders were the ancestors of the people who were still there. The cultural and genetic continuity was demonstrable, but the damage was done. By the time the science caught up with the politics, most of the mounds had been ploughed under, built over, or simply erased. Of the estimated 100,000 or more mounds that existed at European contact, the vast majority are gone. Why does this connect to London? Because the same logic applies. In both cases, extraordinary structures, whose existence challenges a comfortable narrative about civilization, were either destroyed or buried or explained away. In both cases, when you look carefully at what actually survived, you find not a clean story of progress and replacement, but a palimpsest, a layered document in which the older writings keep bleeding through. Let us go back to London, to the specific buildings and institutions that existed before the fire. The Temple Church, built by the Knights Templar in the 12th century, consecrated in 1185. Circular in plan, modelled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Survived the fire of 1666 because it was just outside the main burned area. The Knights Templar were a military religious order founded in the early 12th century. They became extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily wealthy, and extraordinarily mysterious. They were dissolved by Pope Clement III in 1312, their leadership burned at the stake, their records scattered. What they knew, what they found during their decades based on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where according to some accounts they excavated extensively, has been the subject of speculation for 7 centuries. What is documentable is this: the Templars built in ways that were, even by medieval standards, unusual. They incorporated geometric principles and proportional relationships into their architecture that suggest knowledge extending well beyond what a 12th century religious order should have had access to. Architecture is a form of knowledge. The proportions of a building encode the mathematical understanding of the people who designed it. And Templar architecture reflects a tradition going back through Islam and through classical antiquity, and through something before that, something encountered during their time in the Near East. What knowledge? Here is where we need to talk about something called sacred geometry, not as an occult concept, not as a mystical practice, but as a historical reality. Sacred geometry is simply the use of specific mathematical ratios and proportional relationships in the design of buildings, particularly buildings with religious or civic significance. These ratios appear across cultures and across time periods in ways that strongly suggest either a shared mathematical tradition or independent discovery of the same underlying principles. The most famous of these is the golden ratio, the relationship between two lengths, such that the ratio of the larger to the smaller is the same as the ratio of their sum to the larger. This ratio, roughly 1.618 to 1, appears in the Parthenon in Athens, in the Great Pyramid of Giza, in the proportions of the human body, in certain shell spirals, in the reproductive patterns of plants. It appears in medieval European cathedrals. It appears in Islamic geometric art. It appears in structures built by pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas. It is not magic, it is mathematics. But the question of how the same mathematical principles ended up encoded in structures on opposite sides of the planet, built by civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other, is a genuine historical puzzle. The standard answer is parallel development. Humans independently discovered the same mathematical truths because those truths are real and accessible to anyone sufficiently advanced in mathematical thinking. And this may be correct. But it is not the only possible explanation. And it is worth sitting with the discomfort of not being certain. Because if there was contact, if there were crossings and communications and transmissions of knowledge between the ancient world and the Americas that predate Columbus by centuries or millennia, then the entire framework within which we understand pre-Columbian civilization is wrong. Not wrong in detail, wrong in principle, wrong in the way that a map is wrong when it has blank spaces where there are actually continents. The evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the New World is not nothing. There are linguistic parallels between some Native American languages and some Asian and Near Eastern languages that go beyond coincidence. There are genetic markers in certain South American indigenous populations that suggest contact with Polynesian peoples. There are plant species, like sweet potatoes and cotton, that were present on both sides of the Pacific before Columbus. There are building techniques, like the corbelled arch and certain forms of pyramid construction, that appear in both Mesoamerica and ancient Egypt. None of this proves a single connected global civilization, but it suggests that the isolation model, the idea that the Old World and the New World were completely sealed off from each other until 1492, is probably wrong. And if that model is wrong, then everything built on top of it is at least partly wrong. Every explanation that depends on total pre-Columbian isolation. Every dismissal of indigenous achievement that is grounded in the assumption that complex knowledge could not have reached the Americas. Every story that begins, the first people to do this were the Europeans, and then Columbus. Now let us bring this back to London, to 1666, to the fire, and to what came after it. Sir Christopher Wren was 33 years old when the fire happened. He was already recognized as one of the most gifted mathematical and architectural minds in England. He had been civilian professor of astronomy at Oxford at 25 years old. He was a founding member of the Royal Society, the institution that more than any other embodied the new scientific thinking of the 17th century, the movement we now call the Scientific Revolution. He was, in other words, precisely the kind of person who would be tasked with rebuilding London. And he was, in other ways that are less often discussed, precisely the kind of person who would have access to traditions of architectural and mathematical knowledge that went far deeper than what any typical architect of his era would have known. Because the Royal Society was not simply a gathering of scientists in the modern sense, it was an institution with roots in earlier traditions connected to Freemasonry, to Rosicrucianism, to the Hermetic philosophy of the Renaissance, which itself was a recovery and reworking of very ancient knowledge, primarily Greek and Egyptian in its acknowledged sources, but quite possibly drawing on things even older and less officially acknowledged. This is documented. This is not conspiracy theory. Wren himself was a Freemason. Several of his close collaborators were Freemasons. The symbolism embedded in the buildings he designed, in St. Paul's Cathedral especially, has been analysed by architectural historians and found to contain layers of encoded meaning that go well beyond ordinary Christian iconography. Why would a man rebuilding a major Christian cathedral encode non-Christian symbolic content into its design? Because he was doing two things at once. He was building a cathedral, and he was building something else, something that referenced older traditions, something that connected to the geometry he found in the foundations beneath his feet, something that perhaps honoured what was there before even as it buried it. Let us look at St. Paul's Cathedral more carefully, not as a building you walk past on a sightseeing tour, but as a document, a three-dimensional document encoding specific kinds of knowledge. The dome of St. Paul's is the most immediately recognizable element. Its proportions are derived via Michelangelo's dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, from a tradition of dome building that goes back through Byzantium to the ancient world. But Wren did not simply copy. He modified, he calculated. He spent years working out the mathematics of the dome, inventing, in the process, techniques that engineers still study. The dome is not one dome. It is three nested structures: an inner dome, a brick cone, and an outer dome. The brick cone carries the weight of the lantern at the top and distributes it to the drum below. The inner dome gives the interior its visual proportion. The outer dome gives the exterior its silhouette against the sky. This is engineering of the first order, but it is also geometry, and the geometry of the dome, the specific ratios of its curves, the relationship between the drum and the dome and the lantern, encodes the same proportional relationships found in much older structures. There is a measurement associated with the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is the relationship between the pyramid's height and the circumference of its base. That relationship, when you run the numbers, produces a very close approximation of the mathematical constant pi, roughly 3.14-159 and continuing. This was either an extraordinary coincidence or the ancient Egyptians understood pi. Most Egyptologists today accept the latter. The ancient Egyptians understood pi, and they encoded it in their greatest structure. The dome of St. Paul's contains similar encoded ratios. This is not a secret. Architectural historians have noted it. What they have not generally been willing to say is what it implies. That Wren was aware of these ratios not simply as mathematical curiosities, but as part of a living tradition of proportion that connected his work, consciously, to the work of the ancient Egyptians. How did that tradition travel from ancient Egypt to 17th century London? Through many channels. Through the Greek philosophers who studied in Egypt and brought mathematical knowledge back to Athens. Through the Roman architects who inherited the Greek tradition. Through the Islamic scholars who preserved and extended classical mathematics during the medieval period. Through the Knights Templar who spent decades in the Near East and brought knowledge back to Europe. Through the Freemasons, whose symbolic language and ritual structure preserves, in encoded form, knowledge from traditions going back to the builders of Solomon's Temple, which was itself built by craftsmen, trained in Egyptian architectural traditions. This is a very long chain, and chains can be broken. Knowledge can be lost and reinvented. The same mathematics can be discovered by multiple civilizations independently. None of what I have just described proves a single continuous tradition stretching from ancient Egypt to Christopher Wren. But it does describe a world in which such a tradition was possible. And it describes a man, Christopher Wren, who was uniquely positioned to know about and perpetuate such a tradition. And it describes a moment, the Great Fire of 1666, when the existing city was cleared and a man with that position and that knowledge was given the authority to rebuild it from scratch. What does a man with that knowledge build when given a clean slate? He builds London. The London we know. The London of domes and steeples and stone courts. The London that is sold to tourists as old and original and historically authentic, when in fact it is less than 400 years old, designed by a single man in the 1670s and 1680s, layered over something far older that was only partially destroyed by the fire and that is still there, beneath the streets, beneath the foundations, beneath the dome of St. Paul's, waiting. Now, here is where we need to go to North America. Because the Mississippian culture, the builders of Cahokia, and the hundreds of related mound complexes did not simply build mounds, they built cities. And those cities had a specific geometry, a specific relationship between the major structures, a specific orientation with respect to the cardinal directions and the movements of the sun and moon, a specific set of proportional relationships between the sizes of the major mounds and the distances between them. When archaeologists and astronomical archaeologists began systematically measuring these relationships at Cahokia and related sites, they found things that were deeply uncomfortable for the prevailing narrative of pre-Columbian North American civilization. The major axis of Cahokia, the line running north-south through Monk's Mound, is oriented within a fraction of a degree of true north. Not magnetic north, true north, the celestial pole. This requires astronomical knowledge and measurement techniques sophisticated enough to determine the precise direction of true north, which is not something you can do casually with sticks and shadows. It requires sustained observation over multiple years, careful record keeping, and mathematical reasoning. The Mississippians were doing this. Furthermore, the placement of Monk's Mound relative to the subsidiary mounds around it and the relative sizes of those mounds encode proportional relationships that match the proportional relationships found in other ancient astronomical centers on the other side of the world, not vaguely, not approximately, with a degree of precision that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The specific comparison that comes up most often in this literature is with Stonehenge, the great megalithic complex on Salisbury Plain, built in phases over roughly 1,000 years, beginning around 3000 BC. Stonehenge is oriented to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. This required sustained astronomical observation and sophisticated mathematical reasoning. What is not commonly discussed is the degree to which the principles behind Stonehenge and the principles behind Cahokia resemble each other. Not the specific technique, one uses enormous standing stones, the other uses earthworks, but the underlying logic, the orientation toward significant astronomical events, the encoding of proportional relationships derived from astronomical observation, the use of a large central monument surrounded by smaller structures at specific measured distances. These are the same ideas expressed in different materials in different landscapes. The Woodhenge. In 1961, archaeologists working at Cahokia discovered a series of large post holes arranged in a circle, roughly 410 feet in diameter. The posts were enormous, many of them over a foot in diameter. When the pattern of the holes was mapped and analyzed, the circle of posts, which researchers named Woodhenge, was found to be astronomically aligned to the equinox sunrise, aligned to the solstice sunrise, aligned in ways consistent with its use as a solar calendar. A circle of wooden posts used as a solar calendar in North America, built by indigenous people somewhere between 900 and 1100 AD. The parallels to Stonehenge are not superficial. The basic concept, a circular arrangement of large uprights aligned to astronomical events, is specific enough that when you see it in two different places, built by people who were not supposed to have been in contact with each other, you have to at least ask the question. And the question is not, did Cahokia copy Stonehenge? That is not what the evidence suggests. The question is there a common source? A common tradition of astronomical architecture so old that it predates both Stonehenge and Cahokia and spread to both places through some means we no longer understand? This is the kind of question that official archaeology is deeply reluctant to ask. Not because it is a bad question, but because the implications are so large. If there is a common source tradition for astronomical architecture, old enough and widespread enough to have reached both Britain and North America, then what we know about ancient human history is a small island in a very large sea of things we do not know. And large institutions are not built to thrive in large seas of things they do not know. They are built to maintain the small island. Let us come back to London, to the period just before the fire, and to some things about that period that do not receive enough attention. The 17th century in England was a time of extraordinary intellectual ferment. The Civil War, the execution of Charles I, the Commonwealth, the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution, all of this happened within a single century. England was arguing furiously about everything, about religion, about government, about the nature of reality itself. And in the middle of all this, there was a remarkable set of overlapping institutions doing something that most historians have underestimated. They were recovering and systematizing ancient knowledge, the Royal Society, which Wren helped found. The network of Freemason lodges being formalized in England during exactly this period, and the antiquarian scholars like John Aubrey, among the first to seriously document Stonehenge and Avebury, who made careful measurements and asked careful questions about who built these structures and why. Aubrey was a friend of Wren's. They moved in the same circles. They talked about these things. What did they talk about? The mathematical principles of ancient architecture, the relationship between certain ancient structures and astronomical phenomena. Egypt, the tradition of priestly knowledge that Egypt represented, a wisdom tradition that predated all existing religions and that each religion had partially preserved and partially obscured. This was the intellectual atmosphere in which the rebuilding of London was planned. And here is something that almost never appears in accounts of the Great Fire and its aftermath. Wren's plan for rebuilding London was not implemented. He submitted a plan, an extraordinary plan, a complete reorganization of the city, with wide diagonal avenues radiating from key nodes, with a rational grid of secondary streets, with clear sightlines and geometric order imposed on what had been an organic medieval tangle. The plan was not approved. Instead, within a few weeks of the fire, property owners were told they could rebuild on their existing plots, on their existing street lines. The City of London that we know today, with its winding streets and irregular blocks, is the result of this decision. Not a planned city, a city rebuilt on the ruins of its predecessor, following the same lines that the predecessor followed. Why? The official explanation is property rights. Property owners had rights to their specific plots of land, too politically entrenched to be overridden, even for the most compelling urban planning rationale. And this is probably largely true. But consider what it means. It means that the street pattern of London, the pattern that predated the fire, that predated the medieval city, that in some cases predated the Roman city, was preserved. The property rights that accrued to it were too valuable to disturb. The street pattern of Roman Londinium is still there, under the current streets. The fire burned the buildings. It did not burn the streets. And when the buildings went back up, they went back up on the same streets, the same plots, the same lines. So when you walk through the city of London today, you are walking on streets whose routes were determined, in some cases, by choices made 2,000 years ago. The Walbrook, one of those buried rivers, ran roughly north to south through the middle of the Roman city. The street called Walbrook still follows its course. There is a building, Cannon Street Station, whose northern wall sits on the line of the Roman riverside wall. The Mithraeum, the temple of Mithras discovered during post-war construction in the 1950s, sat on the bank of the Walbrook precisely because that river was sacred ground, and the Mithraic cult specifically chose sacred ground for its temples. The Mithraeum in London is one of the most important Roman archaeological finds in British history. It was discovered by accident in 1954, during construction, excavated rapidly, and then moved, physically dismantled and relocated, because the development of the City of London could not wait. The site where it had been for roughly 1,600 years is now occupied by a modern office building. The temple itself is in the basement of that building, reconstructed, open to visitors, cut off from its original context, its spatial relationships, its underground position relative to the buried river. That was the whole reason it was there. That is a choice, a very specific choice about what matters and what does not. Now, let us go further underground. In the 19th century, London dug the world's first underground railway. The construction of this network required enormous amounts of underground excavation through the heart of the oldest city in England. What did they find? They found Roman, they found Saxon, they found medieval, expected. They found, in several locations, things they did not expect and did not publish extensively. There are accounts, many of them from the workers themselves, of chambers encountered and sealed off, of passageways that went in directions that served no engineering purpose, of masonry using techniques and proportions that did not match any known period of London construction. Some of this is certainly myth. The underground is a naturally myth-generating environment, dark, old, full of strange sounds and unexpected structures. But not all of it is myth. There are too many separate accounts, from too many different parts of the system, from too many different periods of construction, describing too similar a class of anomalous discovery. And some of these accounts come from engineers and surveyors. The formal archaeological record of underground construction is incomplete and fragmented precisely because there was never a systematic effort to record what was found. Artifacts were discarded, structures were broken through, and the rubble used as fill. The economic pressure to complete the railway on schedule overwhelmed any consideration of what might be lost in the process. When the Jubilee line was extended in the 1990s, a much better attempt was made. An archaeological unit was embedded in the construction project. Things were found and recorded. But even then, the imperative was speed. Record quickly, move on. What the city cannot wait for is precisely what ends up buried. And buried beneath the underground, beneath the Victorian sewers, beneath the medieval foundations and the Roman levels, is the ground that was already significant before any of those layers existed. The specific topography, the hills, the buried riverbeds, the places where Bronze Age people threw their offerings into water that later became streets. All of that is still there. It does not burn. It does not corrode. It waits. Let us go north, away from London, to the Scottish Highlands and the Orkney Islands, where the oldest surviving structures in the British Isles are found. Skara Brae, The Neolithic village preserved in the sand dunes of Orkney's west coast dates to roughly 3100 BC. The stones of Stennis, a circle of standing stones on Orkney, dates to approximately the same period, making them contemporary, with or slightly older, than Stonehenge. These are not primitive structures. Skara Brae has stone furniture, stone beds, stone shelves, stone box hearths, a system of covered alleyways connecting the houses, a small niche in one corner that may have been a toilet connected to a rudimentary drainage system. These people, whom we think of as Neolithic, living 4,000 years before Rome, had comfortable, thoughtfully designed homes with built-in furniture and drainage. We underestimate them systematically, and for reasons that have nothing to do with the evidence. The same people who built Skara Brae built the Ness of Brodgar, a site discovered in 2003 and still being excavated, which appears to be a monumental complex of ceremonial buildings of a scale and sophistication that was not anticipated. The Ness of Brodgar is being called by some archaeologists the most significant Neolithic site ever discovered in Britain. It predates Stonehenge. It has walls several feet thick. It has interior features suggesting complex ritual use. It has art, incised patterns on the stonework that show a sophisticated aesthetic tradition. The people who built the Ness of Brodgar were connected to the same tradition that built the great megalithic monuments of Ireland, France, Portugal, Malta, and eventually the British mainland. This Atlantic megalithic culture shared architectural and astronomical traditions across a wide geographic area and a long time period. It extended from Scandinavia to North Africa. And here is the question that the evidence keeps pressing toward. How far west did it extend? Because there are megalithic structures in North America. Not widely publicized, not widely accepted, but present. The most famous, or at least the most debated, is the site known as Mystery Hill in Salem, New Hampshire, now called America's Stonehenge. The site consists of a complex of stone structures, walls, chambers, aligned stones, arranged across several acres. The date of construction is disputed. Some analyses suggest construction activity going back 3,000 years or more. The alignments of certain stones to solstice and equinox positions have been confirmed by independent astronomical analysis. Who built it? The answer most comfortable to mainstream archaeology is colonial-era farmers. New England farmers built root cellars and livestock enclosures from stone, but the specific alignments at Mystery Hill and the specific architecture of certain chambers are not consistent with agricultural storage. They are consistent with intentional astronomical orientation. The alternative explanation is pre-Columbian construction by either indigenous Americans or by early European visitors, possibly Celtic or Norse, who were in contact with the megalithic tradition. There is evidence for Norse presence in North America, at least as far back as around 1000 AD, at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. This is not disputed. The Norse were in North America. They did not establish permanent settlements, apparently, but they were there. Could they have travelled further south? Could they have introduced some elements of the European megalithic tradition into North America? Or could they have encountered a parallel tradition that had developed independently? All of these are open questions. None of them have definitive answers. All of them point toward a picture of pre-Columbian Atlantic contact that is significantly more complex and more interesting than the standard isolation model suggests. And this matters for London, because London, the London before the fire, was a city shaped by these traditions, by the Celtic tradition that predated Rome, by the Druidic tradition that the Romans tried to destroy, but did not entirely destroy, by the tradition of the standing stones and the sacred hills and the river offerings and the astronomical orientations that had been part of the British landscape for 4,000 years before Julius Caesar set foot on the island. All of that was part of the city, part of its bones. And on September 2nd, 1666, the buildings that had been layered over all of that tradition for 1,500 years caught fire and burned. And what rose in its place was something new, something that looked backward to the ancient world, but was actually entirely modern. A city designed on Enlightenment principles, with Masonic symbolism embedded in its key structures, with a dome encoding ancient mathematical knowledge in ways that most people who walked beneath it would never understand. The question is whether this was a loss or a continuation. Because here is the argument on the other side. The rebuilding of London was not an erasure, but a rescue. The people who redesigned London after the fire were not destroying old knowledge but preserving it, encoding it in stone in ways that would outlast any specific building or tradition that might be burned or suppressed. The Freemasons have always claimed this is what they do. They claim to be preservers of ancient knowledge, carriers of a tradition, going back to the builders of Solomon's temple, who were themselves trained in Egyptian architectural traditions. The specific claims of Masonic history are often unprovable and sometimes demonstrably legendary, but the underlying assertion that Masonic symbolism preserves in encoded form mathematical and philosophical knowledge from ancient traditions is taken seriously by scholars who have analyzed the architecture of Wren and his contemporaries. If that is true, then the Dome of St. Paul's is not a replacement for what was there before. It is a translation, a carrying forward in new materials and new forms of principles encoded in structures going back to the Druids and beyond. This is a more consoling interpretation, but it does not resolve the question of what was actually destroyed. Even if Wren preserved the mathematical principles, he did not preserve the physical structures. He did not preserve the street of ancient temples whose locations we can only guess at from the ox skulls under the foundations and the names of streets. He did not preserve, because he probably did not know about, the connections between those London structures and the structures being built at the same time, in the same mathematical tradition, in the forests and river valleys of North America. Now, let us add another layer to this, because the story of what happened to the mound builders of North America in the centuries after European contact is directly relevant to understanding what happened in London and why the burning and rebuilding of a single city matters in a much larger context. When Europeans began settling North America in earnest in the 17th century, the same century as the Great Fire, they encountered a landscape shaped by thousands of years of indigenous habitation and management. The forests of eastern North America were not pristine wilderness. They were managed landscapes, deliberately thinned, deliberately burned to create the open park-like conditions that early European settlers described with such wonder. The great chestnut trees, the abundance of game, the clean waterways were the product of centuries of careful indigenous land management. The mounds were part of this landscape, not isolated monuments in wilderness, but features of a cultivated world, associated with villages, with fields, with roads, with the whole infrastructure of living civilization. And within a century of sustained European contact, almost all of it was gone. Not burned in a single dramatic fire, dissolved, lost to disease, which the Europeans brought and which spread through indigenous populations at catastrophic rates, lost to displacement, lost to the deliberate erasure of the mound builder myth, which rewrote the history of the people who had built these extraordinary things. Some mounds remained. The largest ones, like Monk's Mound, were too big to destroy easily, but the hundreds of smaller mounds, the subsidiary mounds of Cahokia, the mounds of smaller ceremonial centers across the Mississippi Valley, many of those were plowed under, literally. Farmers drove their plows through 2,000-year-old earthworks because the land was productive and the past was in the way. The destruction of the Great Mound Complex at St. Louis, Missouri, a site that rivaled Cahokia in significance and that sat directly where the city of St. Louis was eventually built, happened in the 19th century. Within living memory of people who died within the living memory of people alive today. St. Louis had an extraordinary collection of mounds. The French had encountered them and recorded them in the 18th century. The early American settlers had marveled at them. And then the city grew, and the mounds were in the way, and they were quarried and leveled and carted off as fill and building material. The last major mound in St. Louis, the Big Mound, was demolished in 1869, demolished with crowds watching. Observers found the whole thing interesting enough to write newspaper articles about. The bones and artifacts that came out of the Big Mound were scattered. Some went to amateur collectors. Some went to institutional collections, where they remained unstudied for generations. Some were simply lost. What was in the big mound? What did it commemorate? What astronomical alignments might its proportions have preserved? We will never know, because the information was destroyed with the structure. The people who destroyed it did not think there was anything worth knowing. They thought they were clearing land. Sounding familiar? This is the London story, not in the sense that there was a fire in St. Louis in 1869, but in the sense that in both cases, structures encoding old knowledge were cleared to make way for new structures encoding new priorities. And in the clearing, something was lost that no subsequent scholarship can fully recover. And in both cases, the people doing the clearing had reasons that seemed good at the time. Economic development, urban improvement, the needs of a growing population. These are not trivial reasons. People need places to live. Cities need to grow. But what is also real is the asymmetry. What is destroyed can never be brought back. What is built in its place can always be torn down and replaced with something else. The structures that encoded the past become rarer and more precious with every passing decade. Monk's Mound is still there. You can still climb it. From the top, on a clear day, you can see the arch in St. Louis across the river. You can see how the land lies. You can see why someone would have chosen this spot to build the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico. But can you understand what the proportions of the mound encode about the astronomical knowledge of the people who built it? Can you understand what the relationship between Monk's Mound and the subsidiary mounds around it was intended to represent? For most people, the answer is no, because the tradition that would have allowed you to read that text was disrupted and broken and finally severed at some point between the peak of Cahokia in the 12th century and the arrival of European settlers in the 17th century. The living teachers died before they could teach, and so we look at Monk's Mound and we call it impressive, and we move on. In exactly the same way that most people look at the dome of St. Paul's and call it beautiful, not asking what is underneath, not asking why it is the size it is, and not some other size, not asking what the man who designed it knew about ancient proportional traditions and where he learned it and what the ultimate source of that knowledge was, not asking the interesting questions. Let us ask some of the questions that this story keeps pressing toward. The first one is about water. Every major ancient sacred site has a relationship to water. Not a coincidental relationship, a deliberate one. Stonehenge is positioned within a landscape including the River Avon, which served as a processional route for the dead. The great temple complex at Karnak in Egypt is aligned to the Nile. The Ness of Brodgar in Orkney sits on a narrow strip of land between two locks. Cahokia sits at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi and the Illinois rivers, the most significant river junction in North America. Londinium sits where the Thames could be crossed. But more than that, it sits at the confluence of several smaller rivers with the Thames. These were not just practical water sources. They were, to the people who chose the site for a sacred city, significant convergences. Places where multiple flows of water came together were considered, in Celtic and in many other traditions, places where multiple flows of spiritual energy came together. Liminal places. The ritual deposits in the Thames, the thousands of objects thrown into the river over thousands of years as offerings, go back to the Bronze Age. They go back to times before Rome, before Celtic culture as we understand it, back to people we cannot name who understood the Thames as sacred. When the rivers were buried, the relationship between the city and its sacred water was severed. The Walbrook, which ran through the heart of the Roman city, was covered over, beginning in the medieval period, fully buried by the 17th century. It still flows beneath the streets, but you cannot see it. You cannot stand beside it. You cannot dip your hand in it. The living connection is gone. The second question is about light. The astronomical alignments of ancient sacred sites are not decorative. They are the product of sustained, mathematically sophisticated observation of the sky, and they encode that observation in a form that can be read by anyone who knows how to look. At Stonehenge, you can still experience the solstice sunrise over the Heelstone. The alignment is still legible. At Cahokia, the reconstructed Woodhenge still works as an astronomical instrument. But what about London? What were the astronomical alignments of the pre-Roman city, of the Druidic sacred sites that preceded both the Roman city and the medieval city? Those alignments are buried now, beneath streets and buildings and centuries of accumulated urban sediment. And what about Wren's London, the axis of St. Paul's Cathedral, the line from the main west door through the centre of the dome and out through the apse at the east end is aligned almost precisely east-west. On the equinoxes, the rising sun shines directly down this axis and illuminates the interior. This is the standard orientation of Christian churches, derived from an older tradition of east-west alignment in sacred buildings, derived in turn from the fundamental astronomical fact that the sun rises in the east on the equinoxes. But Wren went further. When you plot the positions of his churches on a map and look for the lines they form, certain of those churches align in ways that suggest deliberate geometric organization of the city, not a grid visible at street level, a hidden pattern detectable only from above. Researchers have spent considerable energy debating whether these lines are deliberate or accidental. But the possibility that Wren hid a geometric pattern in the placement of his churches is plausible, given what we know about his interests and his affiliations. It is the kind of thing a Freemason, who was also the most gifted mathematical mind of his generation, would do if he wanted to encode knowledge in a form that would survive, inscribed in the landscape of the city itself. And when those lines are extended outward, beyond the city of London, certain of them point toward Glastonbury in Somerset, one of the most ancient sacred sites in Britain. Another points toward Stonehenge. Are these lines deliberate? The debate continues. It will probably not be resolved definitively without documentary evidence of Wren's intent. What does exist is the geometry. The positions of the churches are what they are, and Wren was more than capable, mathematically and intellectually, of doing this deliberately. Wren built 51 churches in London after the fire. 51. Each one a distinct design, each one solving a different architectural problem, each one expressing a specific set of geometric and proportional ideas. The sheer volume of this work is staggering. No other architect before or since has had such an opportunity, and very few have had the genius to take advantage of it as completely as Wren did. There is a triangle, formed by the positions of three specific churches: Christ Church, Newgate Street, St. Mary Le Bow, and St. Paul's itself. The triangle these three form has proportions that, when worked out mathematically, echo the proportions found in certain ancient geometric traditions. There are lines, running through clusters of churches, pointing toward significant external locations. One line, extended outward from the city, points directly toward Glastonbury in Somerset, the site of one of the most ancient and significant sacred sites in Britain, associated in legend with the earliest Christianity in England, but in actual archaeological terms representing a continuous sacred site going back to the Iron Age at minimum. Another line points towards Stonehenge. Are these lines deliberate? Did Wren consciously orient his churches to point toward the great sacred sites of Britain? Or is this the pattern-finding tendency of human minds, finding shapes in random distributions? The debate continues. What does exist is the geometry. The positions of the churches are what they are, and Wren was more than capable, mathematically and intellectually, of doing this deliberately. This connects to something that happened on the other side of the Atlantic. The astronomical sophistication of pre-Columbian American civilizations is not in dispute. It is documented, measured, accepted by mainstream archaeology. The Maya had a calendar system more accurate than the Julian calendar used in Europe at the time of Columbus. The Anasazi of the American Southwest oriented their kivas to the winter solstice sunrise. The Hopewell culture of Ohio, the people who built the Newark earthworks, the greatest geometric earthwork complex in the world, encoded the 18.6-year cycle of the lunar standstill in their layout. The 18.6-year cycle, the lunar standstill, this is not something you discover by accident. This requires generations of careful systematic observation and recording. This requires mathematics. This requires a tradition of knowledge transmission that is indistinguishable in sophistication from what was happening at Stonehenge. And yet, In the popular understanding of pre-Columbian North America, these people are still thought of as primitive, as peoples without writing, without cities, without civilization in any meaningful sense. Peoples who were essentially living in the Stone Age when Columbus arrived. That image is false. It is demonstrably, archaeologically, astronomically false. But it persists because it serves purposes. It served the purposes of colonization in the 17th and 18th centuries. It serves certain narratives about human progress in the 21st. And those false images had consequences for the physical world. Because if the people who built Cahokia and the Newark earthworks were savages, then their structures were not worth preserving. They were not monuments. They were not libraries. They were in the way, and so they were cleared. The Newark earthworks deserve a long pause. Located in Newark, Ohio, constructed by the Hopewell culture roughly 2,000 years ago, the Newark earthworks in their original extent covered more than 4 square miles of land. 4 square miles of precisely measured, geometrically ordered earthworks, including a perfect circle, a perfect octagon, and a set of parallel walls running in a specific direction. The perfect circle has a diameter of about 1,054 feet. When you stand inside the Great Circle, you cannot see the walls from the center because the walls are over the visual horizon. You are inside something like a geometric room so large you cannot see all its walls at once. The octagon is aligned. Its major axis points to the most northerly moonrise on the 18.6-year cycle. When the moon rises at its most northerly point on this cycle, it aligns precisely with the opening of the octagon. Not approximately. Precisely within the margin of error of the original construction. To build an octagon that does this, you need to know that the 18.6-year cycle exists. You need to have been watching the moon for at least 2 complete cycles, which means at least 37 years of continuous, careful observation. You need to have developed a system for recording and transmitting those observations. You need to be able to translate astronomical data into precise geometric measurements on the ground. The Hopewell people had all of this. What they did not have, according to everything we know about them, was contact with the astronomers of Stonehenge, or Egypt, or Mesopotamia, where comparable astronomical sophistication is found. And yet, the sophistication is comparable. In some respects, notably the precision of the lunar standstill alignment, the Newark earthworks surpasses what is found in the European megalithic tradition. How do we account for this? We do not, fully. We note it, we measure it, we publish papers, and then we file it under remarkable coincidence and move on. But if you do not want to move on, if you want to sit with it, the only answer that makes genuine logical sense of all the evidence is that this impulse to observe the sky, to measure its cycles, to build structures encoding those measurements, is fundamental. It is not particular to any culture. It is particular to human consciousness operating at a certain level of sophistication, with sufficient stability to sustain multi-generational projects. Wherever humans have that stability and continuity, they build astronomical monuments. And this matters for London. It matters for 1666. It matters for Christopher Wren and the Dome of St. Paul's, and the 51 churches, and the buried rivers, and the ox skulls under the foundations. Because the thing that London had, before the fire, and in a different form after the fire, is accumulated time. The layering of human responses to place, generation after generation, each one building on what was there before, each one partially erasing and partially preserving what it inherited. He did not just rebuild a city, he wrote another layer on an extremely old palimpsest. And the palimpsest keeps going. The London of the Blitz, bombed again in the 1940s and rebuilt. The London of the financial revolution of the 1980s, which tore down significant portions of the Victorian city. The London of the 21st century, with its glass towers casting shadows on Roman walls and Wren's churches and the reconstructed Mithraeum in the basement of a Bloomberg building. Layer upon layer, each one partially erasing, partially preserving, partially transforming. The one constant is the Thames. The river is still there. It has been controlled, channeled, embanked, managed, but it is still there. The sacred water still flows. And in the Thames mud, if you know where to look, you can still find ritual deposits going back 4,000 years. Bronze Age tools, Roman altars, medieval pilgrim badges, Victorian curiosities, all of it in the same river that the first people to call this place sacred threw their offerings into, believing that the water connected them to something they could not otherwise reach. Now let us talk about specific things that the fire destroyed and what replaced them in a way that highlights the discontinuity rather than the continuity. The Guildhall, the centre of civic governance in the City of London, originally built in the early 15th century, damaged in the Great Fire, repaired rather than demolished, eventually heavily remodelled in the 18th and 19th centuries. It still stands, but its medieval structure was layered over so many times that what you see today is largely a Victorian and modern reconstruction of a 15th century building with fragments of the original fabric surviving only in specific locations. What is beneath the Guildhall? In the 1960s and 1970s, during renovation work, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary beneath the floor of the Guildhall Yard, a Roman amphitheatre, the largest Roman amphitheatre in Britain, capable of holding somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 spectators. Its walls still stood to a height of several feet in places when it was discovered. Its elliptical arena floor was preserved. It had been there, beneath the Guildhall, for 1,600 years. Not just beneath the Guildhall, beneath the city's civic centre. The centre of London governance had been built directly on top of the centre of Roman public spectacle. Either by deliberate choice, someone wanted to build the new civic centre on the site of the old one, or by the kind of unconscious cultural memory that causes people to repeatedly choose the same significant locations without knowing quite why. The amphitheatre is now accessible. There is a visitor centre. You can go see it. It is extraordinary. But it is also fundamentally inaccessible in the way that really matters, which is in the way that would allow you to understand its original context. You can see the stone, you can read the interpretive panels, but you cannot feel what it felt like to be there in the 2nd century, to stand in the arena or to sit in the tiers, to understand what this space meant to the city that built it. That understanding is gone. Gone in 1666, when the city burned and the patterns of life that had grown around the existing structures were disrupted. Gone much earlier, when the Roman civic traditions that had made an amphitheatre meaningful ceased to exist. Gone in the slow accumulation of different ways of life over the 16 centuries between the amphitheatre's active use and its rediscovery. What about St. Bride's Church? St. Bride's is the church of journalists and the press, sitting just off Fleet Street, bombed in the Blitz and rebuilt, but before that, burned in 1666 and rebuilt by Wren. The current building is Wren's, with its famous tiered spire that was allegedly the inspiration for the tiered wedding cake. Beneath St. Bride's, you can go down. There are archaeological remains in the crypt, remains of earlier churches on the same site, going back to the 6th or 7th century. But beneath the earliest Christian foundations, there is something else, a Roman pavement, and beneath that, evidence of a much earlier structure, whose function is not clear. The site of St. Bride's has been a place where people have repeatedly chosen to build something meaningful. The same impulse, responding to the same location, expressing itself in different cultural languages at different times. What is it about this particular spot on this particular slight rise above the old Fleet River Valley that kept drawing builders? We do not know. The answer is in the ground, in layers we have partially excavated and partially destroyed and partially sealed beneath the current building. The full answer is probably inaccessible, but the fact that people kept choosing this place suggests that the place itself has qualities that our standard archaeological and historical frameworks are not entirely equipped to detect or describe. This is the most unsettling aspect of this whole inquiry. Not the specific buildings or the specific alignments or the specific traditions, but the implication that place itself carries qualities, that certain spots on the earth have a specific character that successive cultures recognize and respond to in broadly similar ways, and that this character is real, is detectable, but is not currently within the mainstream scientific framework to explain. Geomancy, feng shui. The Celtic concept of the thin place, the locus where the boundary between the visible and the invisible world is unusually permeable. The Druidic concept of nemid, sacred space defined by natural features. The ancient Greek concept of the genius loci, the spirit of a place. Different cultures, different languages, different metaphysical frameworks, but the same underlying observation. Some places feel different from other places. Some places accumulate significance. Some places keep getting chosen. London is one of those places. And the question that haunts the whole history of London, and that the Great Fire of 1696 makes particularly acute, is whether the specific qualities of the place, the qualities that made it London in the first place and kept it London through 2,000 years of change and disruption, survived the fire, or whether what burned in those 4 days in September 1666 included not just buildings and churches and archives and the material accumulated wealth of a century, but something more intangible. Some connection to the original reason for the city, some alignment between the human structures and the qualities of the ground they sat on. And what Christopher Wren built, as beautiful and as mathematically sophisticated as it is a translation. It is not the original. The original is underground, in the ox skulls and the Roman altars and the foundations of foundations. The original is in the rivers that still flow beneath the streets. The original is in whatever it was about this particular bend of the Thames that made the first people who came here throw their treasures into the water and call it sacred. That original is still there, buried, waiting, patient in the way that only things measured in geological time can be patient. Not lost, just covered over. Let us go back to the Americas one more time. The Poverty Point site in Louisiana, built by people who were not farmers but hunter-gatherers, somewhere around 1700 to 1100 BC. 3,000 years ago, 3,000 years before Columbus, built by people who had no agriculture and presumably no social organization complex enough to command the kind of coordinated labor that building this site would have required. Except they built it. Poverty Point is a complex of concentric ridges, 6 of them in a C shape. The ridges are enormous. The outer ridge is half a mile in diameter and still stands in places to a height of 6 feet. Built entirely from hauled soil, basket by basket, over generations. The site also includes several mounds, the largest of which stands roughly 70 feet tall. The orientation of the site, the direction the open end of the C-shape faces, is toward the equinox sunrise. Again, the equinox. The moment when day and night are equal, the moment that connects to the deepest cycles of the year. This is 3,000 years ago, in Louisiana. By hunter-gatherers, who we classify, based on their subsistence strategy, as simple, not complex, not civilized, not capable of sustained cooperative effort. The classification system is wrong. The categories are insufficient. A society can be non-agricultural and still be sophisticated. A society can lack writing, as we define it, and still possess and transmit complex knowledge. And here is the connection to London. The people who built Stonehenge, roughly contemporary, with the people of Poverty Point, also were not using a Mesopotamian-style state bureaucracy. The British Isles in 2000 BC did not have cities in the Mesopotamian sense. They did not have writing, and yet they built Stonehenge. The same capacity that the people of Poverty Point had, the capacity to organize cooperative effort around ritual and astronomical knowledge, without the intermediary of state bureaucracy, was present in Britain 2,000 years before the Romans arrived. Now, there is a specific detail connecting the 17th century to the ancient Americas that is rarely discussed. The 1660s and 1670s and 1680s were a critical period in the history of European colonization of North America. In 1675 and 1676, less than a decade after the Great Fire, a war broke out in New England, known as King Philip's War. It was, in proportion to the total population, the bloodiest war in American history. More than half of the English colonial towns in New England were attacked. Thousands of English colonists and thousands of indigenous people died. King Philip's War was a conflict about whether the specific landscape of New England would continue to be understood as an indigenous landscape, shaped by thousands of years of indigenous knowledge, or whether it would be reorganized along English notions of property and settlement. The English won. The indigenous peoples of southern New England were largely destroyed or scattered. The landscape was reorganized along English lines. These two events, the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire and the destruction of indigenous New England in King Philip's War, happened at exactly the same moment. They were shaped by the same culture. They expressed the same values, the same priorities, the same understanding of what mattered and what did not. In London, the old structures burned, and new, better ones were built in their place. The old knowledge was encoded, by Wren, in the new buildings. In New England, the old structures were deliberately destroyed. The wheatus and longhouses, and the managed forests, and the sacred sites, and the centuries of accumulated indigenous knowledge about a specific landscape were not encoded. They were erased. The difference was one of category. The structures of pre-fire London were understood as part of the rebuilder's heritage. The structures of indigenous New England were understood as obstacles. Let us talk about Newgate Prison. Newgate Prison stood in various forms from the 12th century until it was demolished in 1902. It stood at the gate in the old Roman wall called Newgate, the western gate into the city. In the Great Fire of 1666, Newgate was badly damaged. It was rebuilt almost immediately. But that is not the point. The point is the gate itself. Newgate was a gate in the Roman wall. When they built the new Newgate Prison, after the fire, they built it incorporating the gate structure, the medieval gatehouse that had itself been built into and on top of the Roman gate. This is the palimpsest in physical form, a gate built into a Roman wall, a medieval gatehouse built into the Roman gate, a prison built into the medieval gatehouse. The layers going down, each one using the bones of what was there before, each one changing the function while preserving the location. When Newgate Prison was demolished in 1902, the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, was built on its site. Justice, in a different form, continued to be administered at the same location where the city wall had stood, and where the gate had stood, and where the prison had stood. The location carries meaning. It continues to carry meaning even when the specific structures are gone. Something in the human response to place persists. Now, what lies beneath London? London clay. The geological substrate of the city is a marine clay deposit laid down roughly 54 million years ago when the Thames Valley was covered by a shallow sea. And in the clay, as the Thames floods and recedes, things get deposited. Things get preserved. Woolly mammoths. The Thames Valley was elephant country during the Pleistocene. Mammoth bones are not rare finds in London. They come up regularly, from building sites, from river dredging. The Thames mudlarks, the people who walk the foreshore at low tide looking for historical artifacts, occasionally find mammoth bones in the mud. 50,000-year-old bones in a city of 21st century glass towers. Hippos, yes. Hippopotamuses lived in the Thames Valley during the last interglacial period, roughly 120,000 years ago. Giant deer, cave lions, spotted hyenas. The Thames Valley has them all in its deep past. And then, much more recently, on top of all that deep time, the humans, the Paleolithic hunters, the Mesolithic people who lived by the Thames as the climate warmed after the last ice age, the Neolithic farmers, the Bronze Age people who threw their swords and ornaments into the river, the Iron Age Celts, the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the medieval city, the Tudor city, the early modern city. The city that burned, all of it down there, all of it beneath the streets. London is older than any version of itself. That is the most important thing to understand about the fire of 1666. It burned the buildings. It did not burn the place. The place is still there, under the pavement, under the clay, under the river mud, carrying the accumulated weight of all the times anyone has ever recognized this particular bend of the Thames as significant. Now let us return one more time to North America, because there is a specific connection between the Thames and the Mississippi that is rarely made explicit. Both rivers are central to the identity of their respective civilizations. The Thames is not just a river running through London. It is what London is made of. You cannot separate London from the Thames. The Mississippi is the central axis of the North American continent. Every major civilization of the eastern woodlands was oriented toward it. The trade networks ran along its tributaries. The cities sat at its confluences. The sacred geography of the eastern woodlands was organized around the Mississippi as surely as the sacred geography of England was organized around the Thames. And at the greatest confluence, where the Missouri and the Illinois rivers join the Mississippi, that is where Cahokia was built. Just as Londinium was built at the place where the Fleet and the Walbrook and the Effra joined the Thames. Confluence, the joining of waters. In culture after culture, this is where the sacred centers are built, because the joining of waters is where the lines of the landscape converge, where the power that flows along rivers accumulates and concentrates. You can call this animism, or you can call it geophysics. The actual material reality of river confluences does concentrate certain qualities: water quality, sediment deposition, flood risk, and flood benefit. The specific ecology of the zone where two rivers mix. These are real qualities, detectable by anyone who lives on rivers for generations and pays careful attention. The cultures that called confluences sacred were not projecting superstition onto neutral geography. They were responding to real patterns in the landscape. Both London and Cahokia, by sitting at their respective confluences, were responding to the same class of real patterns. In different cultures, in different materials, but with the same underlying logic. This is the deepest connection between them. Not transmitted tradition, not contact or influence, but the same human intelligence responding to similar geographic realities in broadly similar ways, building the center of civilization where the waters meet, encoding astronomical knowledge in the proportions and orientations of the central structures, creating cities that were simultaneously practical and sacred. The tradition of sacred geography in Britain was fragmented and disrupted by the Romans, who destroyed the Druidic centers, by the Christians, who built their churches on pagan sacred sites, by the Puritans, who stripped the churches of their imagery, by the rationalists of the 17th and 18th centuries, who reinterpreted the landscape in mechanical rather than sacred terms. And yet the tradition survived, in folklore, in the naming of places, in the persistent associations of certain hills and rivers with specific qualities, in the Masonic tradition that Wren and his colleagues were embedded in the practice of building churches on the sites of pagan temples. The tradition survives, always, in some form, even after the burning. That is the argument for hope in this otherwise somewhat gloomy story. That erasure is never complete, that the layers always show through, that the original logic of sacred geography, the recognition of certain places as significant, connected to something larger than any single culture's interpretation of them, cannot be fully destroyed by any fire or any redevelopment project. The body knows, even when the mind has forgotten. The body knows to go to the old places and to bring something and to stand in the alignment and to feel whatever it is that gets felt when you stand there. People still gather at Stonehenge for the solstice, even though almost no one can explain, in any culturally transmitted traditional sense, why this is the right thing to do. But they go. Something draws them. Something is still drawing people to London too. To the Thames at dawn, to the dome of St. Paul's in the early light, to the stone in the wall on Cannon Street that most people walk past without noticing, but that has been in roughly the same location for a very long time, patient and inexplicable, and connected to something that does not have a modern name. Let us go to the specifics of what was actually different about post-fire London. Because it would be wrong to give the impression that the rebuilding simply restored what was there before. Some things changed dramatically and permanently. Before the fire, London was predominantly timber-framed. The medieval city was a city of wood, half-timbered buildings, some of them 6 or 7 stories tall in the sense that each floor projected out and slightly over the one below, creating narrow canyons of overhanging wood. These were extraordinary structures in their way, complex, labor-intensive, representing centuries of accumulated craft knowledge about working with wood. After the fire, by law, London was rebuilt in brick and stone. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 mandated masonry construction and regulated building heights and street widths. This was the practical lesson of the fire. Wood burns. Stone does not burn in the same way, but the shift from timber to masonry is also a shift in the relationship between the building and its ground. Timber buildings rest on the ground lightly. They can be moved, in principle. They decay and are replaced. Their relationship to a specific site is temporary, conditional. Masonry buildings press into the ground. They commit to a site. Their foundations change the site. They are harder to remove. They persist. The rebuilding of London in masonry committed the city to its site in a way that the timber city had not. The stone churches of Wren, the brick streets and houses of the post-fire city, these were not temporary. They were permanent statements about what this place is and what it will continue to be, and that permanence has had consequences. The post-fire city set the pattern for the next 350 years. The specific buildings have been changed, many of them, but the pattern they established, the street grid, the relationship between the City of London and the surrounding areas, the position of the major civic and religious institutions, all of this was fixed by the choices made in the 1670s and 1680s. We live in a city whose fundamental organization was decided in a decade following a catastrophe. That is extraordinary, and it means that the specific intentions and ideas of the people who made those decisions, Christopher Wren and his contemporaries, are encoded in the physical structure of a city that is still, in important ways, governed by those original decisions. What were those intentions? Partly practical, streets wide enough for 2 carts to pass, buildings that would not spread fire the way the timber buildings had, drainage and water supply integrated into the street design, but partly something else, partly the expression of a specific intellectual tradition, a tradition that valued mathematical proportion, that connected architectural beauty to mathematical truth, that understood the organization of civic space as a reflection of the organization of the cosmos. This is explicitly Masonic and Neoplatonic. The idea that the ideal city reflects the ideal cosmos, that the relationships between buildings in a city should mirror the relationships between bodies in the solar system, that the proportions of a cathedral dome should encode the same mathematical constants that govern the movement of planets, that beauty and truth are the same thing, and that both can be expressed in geometry. Wren believed this. His written statements about architecture make this clear. The buildings he designed express it in their proportions. The organization of his church plan across the post-fire city encodes it in their spatial relationships. And this tradition, the tradition of the ideal city as cosmic reflection, the tradition of sacred architecture as mathematical truth, is not uniquely European. It is not uniquely Masonic. It is a tradition found in every culture that has ever built a city with any degree of intentionality. The Mississippians had it. Cahokia's organization around Monk's Mound, with the subsidiary mounds laid out at specific distances in specific directions, reflects the same underlying idea. The Great Mound is the center. The city is organized around the center. The center is connected to the sky through the astronomical alignments of the major axis. The city is therefore a reflection of the cosmic order, its human proportions encoding the same mathematical relationships as the movements of the heavenly bodies. The Hopewell had it. The Newark earthworks are a perfect geometric expression of the relationship between human organization and an astronomical reality. The circle and the octagon, laid out on the landscape with extraordinary precision, connected by the alignment to the lunar standstill, are a city-sized instrument for measuring and commemorating the relationship between earth and sky. The people of Poverty Point had it, the concentric ridges oriented to the equinox, the mounds aligned to significant astronomical events, the entire site as a model of the cosmic order. These are all the same idea, expressed in different landscapes, by different peoples, at different times, in different materials, but always the same underlying intention, to create a place that reflects and therefore connects human beings to the mathematical order of the universe. And Christopher Wren standing in the ruins of London in 1670, drawing plans by firelight, was doing the same thing, connecting, encoding, trying to build something that would last, not just as a building, but as a statement about the relationship between the human and the cosmic. He succeeded. St. Paul's Cathedral is still there. The 51 churches, or most of them, are still there. The pattern is still encoded in the landscape of the city. The dome still rises above the Thames. The equinox sunrise still moves along the axis of the nave. What is lost is the connection to what came before. The physical connection, the ability to stand in the Mithraeum on the bank of the Walbrook and feel the relationship between the sacred water and the sacred building. The ability to stand in the grove on Ludgate Hill before any building. Was there and feel what it was about this hill that made people keep choosing it for monuments. That connection is underground, it is buried, it is sealed behind the foundations of genius. But it is still there. And here is one more thing worth saying about the shift from timber to stone. The medieval city had a different relationship to time than the post-fire city does. Timber buildings decay and are replaced. They are not permanent. The medieval city was constantly renewing itself, tearing down the old and building new structures on the same plots, in the same proportions, for the same purposes. The city was organic. It breathed. It changed. The masonry city does not breathe in the same way. Stone buildings persist. They accumulate. They become monuments whether they were intended to be monuments or not. Every building that survives long enough becomes a document of the moment it was built, a frozen record of the specific priorities and specific knowledge of the people who made it. This means that post-fire London is more legible than pre-fire London was. We can read Wren's churches because they are still there. We can analyze the geometry of the dome because the dome has not been replaced. The mathematical knowledge encoded in the post-fire city is accessible in ways that the older knowledge, encoded in timber structures that decayed and were replaced, is not. But this legibility comes at a cost. It is Wren's knowledge that is legible, his tradition, his mathematics, his specific 17th century translation of much older ideas. The older ideas that his buildings reference are visible only in silhouette, implied by the proportions and the orientations, present but not directly accessible. You can read the post-fire city. You cannot fully read what it is pointing toward. The lines that run through the churches toward Glastonbury and Stonehenge point at things that are still there, still standing, still geometrically coherent. But the tradition that would have allowed you to read, the meaning of the alignment, the living understanding of why Glastonbury and Stonehenge are the places they are and not some other places, that tradition is not alive in the post-fire city in the way it was alive in whatever existed before the fire. The rebuilding preserved the mathematics. It did not fully preserve the meaning, and that is perhaps the most precise way to state what was lost on September 2nd in 1666. Not the buildings. Buildings can be rebuilt. Not the streets. Streets can be repaved. Not even the records, though those are irreplaceable. What was lost was the living connection between the specific physical form of the city and the specific understanding of why the city was where it was, why it was shaped the way it was, what the geometry of the streets and the orientation of the buildings and the relationship between the built environment and the landscape were in service of. Christopher Wren had access to that understanding in encoded form, in the mathematical traditions he inherited, but he did not have access to it in living form, in the daily practice of people whose whole way of inhabiting the city reflected that understanding. That died with the medieval city. Maybe earlier, maybe it died with the Druids. Maybe it died with the Romans. Maybe it has been dying in slow stages since the first time someone covered the Walbrook over and called it an improvement. But something of it is still in the ground, still in the rivers, still in the hills, and still in the London stone. Let us talk about the London stone. There is an ancient stone in London, a piece of limestone, roughly 21 inches high and 17 inches wide, set into a metal case in a niche in the wall of a building on Cannon Street. Most people who walk past it every day have no idea it is there. The London stone is mentioned in documents going back to the 12th century. but it appears in those documents as an already existing object of significance, something that was already old and already considered important when the earliest written records of it appear. Its origin is unknown. Its purpose is unknown. Various theories have been proposed over the centuries. One theory is that it was the central milestone of Roman Londinium, the stone from which all distances in Roman Britain were measured. This would make it the umbilicus of the Roman province, the navel from which the measurement of the world radiated. There is some circumstantial evidence for this. The position of the stone, when you account for the fact that it has been moved slightly over the centuries, corresponds to what would have been a central and significant location in the Roman city. Another theory is that it predates the Romans, that it was a sacred stone associated with pre-Roman Celtic ritual practice, that the Romans placed their milestone here specifically because the site was already considered the center of the city by the people who had been living there when they arrived. A third theory, popular in the early modern period, was that the London stone was connected to the mythological founder of London. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth, London was founded by Brutus of Troy, great-grandson of Aeneas, who fled the fall of Troy and eventually reached Britain, where he founded a city he called Troia Nova, New Troy, later corrupted to Trinovantum and eventually becoming Londinium. The stone was supposedly connected to this Trojan founding, an altar or offering stone from the original city. No one takes the Trojan founding literally. It is clearly myth, in the specific sense of a narrative that makes important claims about identity and origin, rather than historical claims about events. But myths encode things. They preserve, in narrative form, memories that are not accessible in other ways. The persistence of the Brutus legend, the specificity of the connection to Troy and to the stone, suggest that there was something real being remembered, even if the specific narrative was legendary. What might be real? The idea that the London stone marked the center of the settlement, the idea that it was a founding monument of some kind, the idea that it was significant enough to be remembered and cared for and written about for at least 1,000 years of English documentary history. The London stone survived the Great Fire. It survived the Blitz. It has been moved several times from its original position to various walls and niches in the buildings that successively occupied the site, but it has always stayed in roughly the same area of the city, within a few hundred feet of its original reported position. The latest move was in 2018. The building it was in was being redeveloped, and the stone was temporarily housed in the Museum of London while the new building went up. Then it was returned in 2022 to a new niche in the ground floor of the new building. The building above it is entirely modern. The stone is set into the wall of what is now a shop. Most people who pass it are on their way somewhere else. But the stone is still there. It has been there since before anyone knows. It has survived everything the city has thrown at it. The Romans did not remove it. The medieval builders did not remove it. The fire did not destroy it. The Victorians who demolished everything else in the neighborhood did not destroy it. The bombs did not destroy it. There is something almost perversely stubborn about the London stone, as if the city itself has decided, at some collective level, that this particular object needs to stay. And if you believe, even a little, that places carry memory, that the landscape holds what the documents lose, that there is something real in the persistent human recognition of specific sites as significant, then the London stone is interesting in a way that goes beyond antiquarianism. It is a physical object that connects the present city to an unknown past, not a past we can fully recover, not a past we can date or describe with any confidence, but a past that was real, that left this stone as its only surviving above-ground remnant in one of the most repeatedly cleared and rebuilt landscapes on Earth. Most cities do not have a stone like this. Most cities, when they burn, lose everything. They rebuild without a physical connection to what came before. The London stone is a thread, a thin, mysterious, almost inexplicable thread connecting the London of today to whatever London was before anyone who lived in it knew how to write. And it is still there, on Cannon Street. Go see it. There is something worth dwelling on before we move past the London stone. The stone is not unique in this respect. Across Britain and across North America, there are objects and places that refuse to be explained and refuse to disappear. Objects that have outlasted every attempt to fit them into the accepted narrative, to explain them away as coincidence or wishful thinking. In Britain, these objects are called standing stones, boundary stones, holy wells, holy, clutie trees, the old hawthorns at sacred springs, where people still tie strips of cloth to ask for healing. These are not tourist attractions. They are not maintained by any national heritage body. They persist because people refuse to let them go. Because generation after generation, without any institutional prompting, people return to these places and recognize them as significant. In North America, the equivalent objects are the petroglyphs, the rock carvings found across the continent from the southwest to the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. Some of these petroglyphs may be several thousand years old. They are carved into rock faces near water, near mountain passes, near the confluences of rivers. Their meaning is often unclear. Their makers are often unknown. But they persist. They have survived everything that has been done to the landscape around them. In both cases, the people who have the deepest relationship to these objects are not archaeologists or heritage professionals. They are the people who have been living near them all along, whose grandparents knew about them. The chain of human attention connecting the present to the deep past is not made of documents and institutions. It is made of people. Ordinary people paying attention to specific places across generations. That chain is fragile. It breaks when populations are displaced. It breaks when knowledge is dismissed rather than received. The Great Fire of 1666 broke several of those chains in London. The colonization of North America broke many more. But some of the chains held. They are still holding. Now let us address something that most histories of the Great Fire skip. The rebuilding of London took decades. The fire was in 1666. St. Paul's was not completed until 1711, 45 years later. The city that emerged was not a finished project that appeared overnight. It was a long, complicated, partially planned and partially improvised process that unfolded over a generation. During those decades, the City of London was, in many parts, an archaeological site. Foundations were being dug, old structures were being encountered and cleared. The ground was being opened in ways it had not been opened for centuries. Who was paying attention? Christopher Wren was. He recorded his finds. The ox skulls. The Roman material beneath the medieval foundations of Old St. Paul's. He noted these things, thought about them, could not fully explain them. John Aubrey was paying attention. His notebooks from this period show a man grappling with the evidence of deep antiquity that the rebuilding was uncovering. But the problem was that there was no institutional structure for preserving this understanding. Archaeology as a discipline did not exist. There was no one whose job it was to record and analyze what came out of the ground. The Royal Society existed, and a few of its members were interested in what we would now call historical archaeology. But the Society's primary focus was on natural philosophy. The economic pressure to build quickly and cheaply overwhelmed any consideration of what might be lost in the process. This is not a uniquely 17th century failure. It is a recurring failure. The building of the underground in the 19th century, the post-war reconstruction in the 1940s. Even today, construction projects in the City of London regularly encounter materials and structures that cannot be fully recorded because the timeline does not allow it. We know some things. We know about the Roman city. We have the walls and the amphitheatre and the Mithraeum and the roads and the burials and the objects. We know about the medieval city, which is better documented in text than the Roman city. We know about the Saxon city in its broad outlines. We know very little about what was there before the Romans. And we know almost nothing about what was there between the beginning of human habitation of the Thames Valley, roughly 500,000 years ago, and the period when the archaeological record becomes legible, perhaps 4,000 years ago, 500,000 years of human presence, most of it invisible. But not all of it. Some of it is still in the ground. Some of it will be found by future excavations in future centuries when our own buildings have been cleared to make way for something new. And the people doing the clearing find the layer that contains the 21st century's foundations, and beneath that, the 20th century's, and beneath that, the 19th century's, and eventually, deep enough that most people would never think to dig, the layer where the earliest Londoners left their mark. Future archaeologists will find us, just as we find the Romans, and they will ask the same questions we ask. Who were these people? What did they think they were doing? What was this place to them? And the answers will be partial, incomplete, refracted through the specific lens of whatever intellectual tradition happens to be dominant in that future moment. Because that is what history is, not a record of what happened. A conversation between the past and the present, mediated by whoever happens to be doing the talking. The fire of 1666 ended one conversation. Christopher Wren began another. And beneath it, in an ox skull under a cathedral foundation, or a stone set into a wall on Cannon Street, the first conversation is still going on. It has never stopped. Let us look at the Great Fire not as a local London story, but as one event in a much larger pattern of fire and rebuilding that characterizes the history of cities. Rome burned in 64 AD. The Great Fire of Rome destroyed much of the city. Nero used the opportunity to rebuild, including a vast palace complex extending across previously dense residential neighborhoods. The rebuilding of Rome after 64 AD was as much a political act as an architectural one. Constantinople burned multiple times. Beijing's Forbidden City was built on the site of earlier capitals, each one cleared to make way for the next. Baghdad was built from scratch in the 8th century as a planned circle city, then destroyed by the Mongols in 1258, then rebuilt differently. Every great city has its fires, its clearings, its moments when the accumulation of the past was cleared and something new was imposed in its place. And in every case, what was cleared was not nothing. What was cleared was someone's accumulated investment in a specific way of understanding a specific place. The question is always, what survives? Not which buildings survive, though that matters, but which understanding of the place survives. Which tradition of responding to the specific qualities of the specific location persists through the clearing. In London, the Masonic tradition, which preserved elements of much older knowledge, survived the fire because it was a tradition of people rather than buildings. It was the tradition that most directly shaped the rebuilding. What was not preserved, what was genuinely lost in 1666, was the vernacular knowledge, the accumulated experience of ordinary people living in specific places in specific ways. The woman who knew that a particular stretch of the Fleet was good for certain medicinal plants. The man who knew that certain weather patterns followed the river valleys in specific ways. The children who played in streets whose angles had been shaped by 1,000 years of organic growth and who developed, in their bodies, a specific knowledge of a specific urban landscape that was destroyed along with the landscape. You cannot rebuild vernacular knowledge. You can rebuild buildings. You cannot rebuild the knowledge that grows in people who live with buildings long enough that the buildings become part of how they think and move and perceive the world. Cahokia had this. The people who lived there for generations knew that place in ways that no subsequent archaeologist will ever know it. They knew it in the way you know the smell of your childhood home. That knowledge was lost when Cahokia was abandoned. It was lost before the ploughing and the quarrying. It was lost when the people left. What remained was the structure, stripped of the living knowledge that gave it meaning, but still structurally present, still geometrically coherent, still oriented to the same sky. Architecture survives, meaning is fragile. The dome of St. Paul's will survive for centuries if maintained. The mathematics Wren embedded in it will be there to be read by anyone patient enough to look. But the living tradition in which that mathematics was meaningful is thin now, preserved in institutions and texts, but no longer widely lived. Most people who look at the dome of St. Paul's see something beautiful. Almost none see something speaking in a specific mathematical language to a tradition of understanding the relationship between geometry and the cosmos that goes back 4,000 years. The meaning is still there, but it is no longer legible to most people. That is its own kind of burning. Let us now address directly the question, that has been hovering over this whole inquiry. The question about what the connection between the fire of London in 1666 and the ancient Americas actually is. Because it would be fair to say, at this point, that the connections we have drawn are thematic rather than causal. We have noted that both London and Cahokia were built at river confluences. We have noted that both civilizations developed astronomical sacred architecture. We have noted that both experienced destruction and rebuilding. We have noted that the same intellectual tradition that shaped the rebuilding of London also shaped the design of Washington, D.C., which was built on land that had been indigenous American territory. These are real connections, but there is a class of evidence that keeps showing up at the edges of this inquiry that makes the thematic connections feel like something more. The Zeno map. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman published a book containing, he claimed, maps and journals of a voyage made by his ancestors in the late 14th century. According to the account, a Venetian explorer accompanied Henry Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney, on a voyage westward across the Atlantic somewhere around 1398. The account described lands beyond Iceland and Greenland, lands that, if the descriptions can be mapped, correspond to the eastern coast of North America. The Zeno account is controversial. Many historians consider it a forgery or a confusion. But some researchers have found specific geographic details that seem too accurate to be fabricated, descriptions of specific features that match the actual geography of locations in Nova Scotia and New England. If the Zeno narrative is even partially accurate, it places a Scottish nobleman with deep connections to the Knights Templar. The Sinclair family were associated with the Templars in North America nearly a century before Columbus. And not just any Scottish nobleman. The Sinclairs built Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, one of the most extraordinary examples of the tradition of sacred architecture we have been discussing. Its carved stonework contains imagery that has been interpreted by various researchers as depicting plants native to the Americas, including aloe and corn, neither of which were known in Europe before Columbus. These claims are disputed. The mainstream view is that the carvings depict European plants that were misidentified by later observers. But the dispute has never been fully resolved. Why does this matter for London? Because the Sinclair family was connected to the Templar tradition. And the Templar tradition was connected to the same tradition of sacred architecture and mathematical knowledge that Christopher Wren was working within when he rebuilt London. And if, in the late 14th century, a Scottish nobleman with these specific connections made it to North America and encountered indigenous American civilization at its height, then the tradition of sacred architecture was not simply a parallel development in two isolated worlds. It was potentially a shared awareness. This is speculation. It is not provable with the evidence currently available, but it is not insane speculation, and it connects to a broader point about the late medieval and early modern period. The period between roughly 1350 and 1666 was a period of extraordinary intellectual activity around the recovery of ancient knowledge. The men of the Renaissance were reaching back to what they called the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology, a supposed primordial wisdom tradition that had been the common source of all subsequent religions and philosophies. And if the Prisca Theologia was real, if there was a genuine ancient wisdom tradition that had once been common to all of humanity, then it would have been in the Americas as well as in Europe. Because the Americas were inhabited by human beings, and if human beings everywhere encounter the sky and the rivers and the hills and eventually develop a sophisticated understanding of their relationship to these things, then the wisdom tradition is not cultural, it is human, it is universal. Which means the astronomical monuments of the Hopewell and the Mississippian peoples are not parallel developments to the megaliths of Britain. They are the same thing, the same fundamental human response to the same fundamental human experience. That is what Stonehenge says. That is what the Newark earthworks say. That is what the Dome of St. Paul's says, in a more recent and more complicated voice. That is what was in London before the fire. And that is what Wren tried to say again, in his way. With his mathematics and his domes and his 51 churches, he was speaking the same language. just with an accent shaped by the 17th century. So what actually happened in London after the fire? Let us look at the specific decisions, one by one. Decision 1. Wren's plan was rejected, and the old street pattern was preserved. We have discussed this. The result was a city that superficially looks medieval in its organization, with winding streets and irregular blocks, but that has Baroque churches and civic buildings dropped into those medieval gaps. A hybrid city, old bones, new clothes. Decision 2. The churches were rebuilt first, before the houses, before the commercial buildings. The religious infrastructure of the city was prioritized. This tells us something about priorities in 1666, but it also reflects the specific importance of the churches to the urban fabric. The churches were not just places of worship. They were landmarks, orientation points, acoustic centers, the nodes around which neighborhood identity formed. Decision 3. The monument was built. Designed by Wren and his collaborator Robert Hooke, the monument to the Great Fire of London is a column in the Doric order, 202 feet tall, positioned exactly 202 feet east of the site where the fire started on Pudding Lane. If you were to tilt the monument over toward the west, its tip would touch the point where the fire began. This is deliberate geometry, a measuring instrument built into the cityscape. Hooke used it as one. He suspended pendulums from the top to measure gravitational variation with altitude. He used it to observe stars. The monument is a scientific instrument in the form of a civic memorial. The geometry of the monument's position is also, depending on how you choose to interpret it, either a coincidence of practical site selection or a deliberate encoded message about the relationship between measurement and memory. 202 feet, both directions. The fire began here. The monument stands there. The distance is equal. The tragedy is measured. The measurement is the memorial. This is the kind of thing Wren and Hooke did. They built meanings into measurements. They made the city into a document. Decision 4. The relationship between the city and the river was formalized. Before the fire, the relationship between the built city and the Thames was relatively informal. There were quays and docks and stairs, organic accumulations of riverside infrastructure. After the fire, the process of formalizing and extending the riverside embankment was accelerated. The Thames became more emphatically a civic edge, a boundary between the city and the water, rather than a permeable zone where the two merged. This shift, subtle but significant, changed the experiential relationship between Londoners and their sacred river. The river was still there, but it was more separated from the city, more controlled, more visible as a backdrop and less accessible as a living element of the urban environment. This process would continue over the following centuries. The great embankments of the Victorian period, built in the 1860s and 1870s, pushed the Thames further away from the city and buried the last of the accessible Thames foreshore beneath massive engineering works. Today, the Thames is visible but largely untouchable from most of central London. The experience of standing at the river's edge, dipping your hand in, throwing something in, which is what the people who made the Bronze Age deposits were doing and what the Roman temple builders near the Walbrook were oriented toward, that experience is largely gone from the city. The sacred water is still flowing, but the city has turned its face away from it. And now, something that I want you to consider very carefully, because this is perhaps the most important connection between what happened in London and what happened in North America, when the mounds of the Mississippian civilization were plowed under in the 19th century. Something very specific was lost. Not just the structures, not just the geometry, not just the astronomical alignments. Lost was the relationship between the structures and the landscape. The mounds sat at the confluence of specific rivers. They were oriented to specific sunrises and moonrises as seen from specific locations. They were part of a system in which the built environment and the natural environment were in specific, intentional, meaningful conversation. When you plow under a mound, you do not just remove the mound, you sever the conversation. In London, after 1666, the same severance happened, more slowly and more subtly. The rivers were buried. The river crossings were replaced by stone bridges that eliminated the experiential quality of river crossing, the sense of passing through water that the earlier crossings had. The groves and open areas that had characterized the pre-urban sacred landscape were built over. The sightlines between significant hills were blocked by new buildings. The conversation between the built environment and the natural landscape, the conversation that had been going on since the first person threw something into the Thames and called the place sacred, was not ended by the fire of 1666. It was gradually muffled, gradually buried, gradually replaced by a different kind of city, one organized around commerce and rational planning rather than around the specific qualities of the natural landscape. Wren's London is magnificent, but it is a city that could theoretically have been built anywhere with a flat enough piece of ground and a river to the south. The older London, the pre-fire London, was a city that could only have existed there, that specific hill, those specific rivers, that specific bend of the Thames. The city was an expression of the place, not a structure imposed upon it. After 1666, the London we have is more imposed, more the expression of a mathematical tradition than an expression of a landscape. Beautiful, lasting, but slightly unmoored from the specific ground it sits on. And perhaps that slight unmooredness is the deepest thing the fire changed. Not the buildings, not the streets, but the relationship between the city and its own foundations. The relationship between human construction and the specific sacred geography that made the construction possible. That relationship is underground now, but we are getting better at reading what is underground. And now, with all of that in mind, let us return to where we started. A fire. 4 days in September 1666. A city reduced to ash. But not the city itself. The buildings burned. The city, the older thing, the accumulation of meaning in a specific landscape at a specific bend of a specific river, did not burn, cannot burn, is not made of combustible material. The fire burned the timber and the thatch. It burned the church roofs and the market stalls. It burned the warehouses and the hall records and the centuries of official documentation of official London. It burned the organic, irregular, slowly accumulated medieval city that had been growing in the shadow of Roman walls and on the pattern of Roman streets for over 1,000 years. It did not burn the rivers. They still flow. It did not burn the hills. Ludgate Hill and Cornhill and Tower Hill, they are still there. It did not burn the sacred geography, the alignment of the city with the sky, the specific qualities of the place that made the first people to come here choose it for something significant. It did not burn the London stone. The stone is still there, in a niche in a wall on Cannon Street, patient and inexplicable and connected to something we do not have a name for. And what Christopher Wren built on top of all that is extraordinary. The dome rising above the Thames, the steeples of the 51 churches, each one a different solution to the same problem of pointing toward the sky in a way that is both beautiful and mathematically precise. The specific geometry hidden in the placement of the buildings, the lines running toward Glastonbury and toward Stonehenge, whether deliberate or not, marking a tradition of connection between London and the older sacred landscape of Britain. Is it the same as what was there before? No. Is it better or worse than what was there before? That is not the right question. It is different. It is the continuation of something, but a continuation that required a break, that involved a loss, that replaced one layer of the palimpsest with another without fully preserving what it was writing over. This is always the condition of the palimpsest. You can read it, but you cannot read all of it. The lower layers bleed through, but imperfectly. The new writing obscures the old without erasing it entirely. London is a palimpsest of enormous depth, deeper than most cities, deeper than most places. 4,000 years of deliberate human significance, written and overwritten on the same landscape, each layer half reading and half obscuring the layers below. And the Great Fire of 1666 is one of the most dramatic rewriting events in that long history. Not because it was the most destructive. The Blitz destroyed more physical fabric. The dissolution of the monasteries destroyed more institutional knowledge. The Roman conquest destroyed more living tradition. But because it happened at a specific moment, when the will and the ability and the specific intellectual tradition needed to do something significant with a clean slate, all converged in one person, Christopher Wren, and because the result of that convergence is still visible, still standing, still dominating the skyline of one of the world's great cities, what they built on top was not what was there before. What was there before is still underneath. And the thing that was underneath is still older than that. And that thing is older still. Going down through Roman altars and Celtic offerings and Bronze Age weapons thrown into the sacred water, going down through the geological deep time of the Thames clay, going down to the moment when the first human being stood at this bend of this river and felt something they could not name but could not ignore, and made a mark. That moment is still happening, in some sense. It never stopped. It is happening beneath the footsteps of 8 million people going about their daily lives on top of it. It is happening in the rivers that still flow beneath the streets. It is happening in the specific quality of light on the dome of St. Paul's at a particular moment on an equinox morning. When the sun rises in the east and moves along the axis of the nave and illuminates the interior in a way that Wren designed, and that the Druids who stood on the hill before any building was there would have recognized as right. And it is happening on the other side of the world in the specific quality of light on the top of Monk's Mound at a particular moment on a solstice morning when the sun rises exactly where the Woodhenge marks it should rise and illuminates a landscape that was the center of a civilization we barely understand, that was cleared and ploughed and built over and ignored, and is only now, slowly and incompletely, being recognized as what it was. The dome and the mound, the Thames and the Mississippi, the ox skulls and the spirit bundles, the Masonic tradition and the Mississippian tradition, the fire that burned in September 1666, and the fires that burned through the indigenous Americas in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. All of it part of the same long human conversation about what this world is and what we are doing in it, and how you build something that says adequately, in stone or earth or word, that you were here and you understood this much, and you wanted to honor what you understood before the fire came again. The fire always comes again, and something always survives. That is the one constant in this entire story. Something always survives. The rivers survive. The hills survive. The London Stone survives. Monk's Mound survives. The alignment of the equinox sunrise still works at the Newark earthworks, even though most of the earthworks are gone. The memory of what was there, encoded in the names of streets and the shapes of fields and the specific ways that human bodies respond to specific places, persists. We are not cut off from the past. We are walking on it. We are breathing it. We are living in cities built on the foundations of cities, built on the foundations of something older still. The question is whether we know it, whether we choose to look, whether we are willing to ask the uncomfortable questions about what was here before and what it knew, and what we lost when we built over it. Those questions do not have clean answers. They probably never will, but asking them is itself a form of preservation. Sitting with the depth of the human past, resisting the temptation to resolve it into a simple story of progress and improvement, holding the complexity of the palimpsest, the layers bleeding through each other, the old conversations audible beneath the new ones. That is a way of honoring what is underground, and it is perhaps the closest we can get to reading the full text of the place. The place is still here. The fire burned the buildings. The place endures. There is a moment, if you have ever been to London and have been lucky enough to be there very early in the morning, before the city properly wakes, when you can stand on Waterloo Bridge and look east and see the dome of St. Paul's rising above the river in the early light. The traffic is thin. The noise of the city is reduced to something bearable. The Thames below you is dark and moving, carrying the same water it has always carried through the same valley it has always occupied. In that moment, if you are paying the right kind of attention, you can feel something. Not mysticism, not religion, not the specific claims of any tradition, just the depth of the place, the accumulation of all the times a human being has stood near this river and felt something in response to it. The Bronze Age person who threw their sword into the water, the Roman legionary who made an offering at the Mithraeum on the Walbrook, the Druid who stood on Ludgate Hill and read the sunrise, Christopher Wren standing in the ruins of the fire, planning the dome. All of them at the same river, all of them responding to the same place. And you, standing there in the early morning, are part of the same sequence, part of the same long human presence at this specific bend of this specific river, in this specific landscape, that has been calling people to it, and holding them, and shaping them, and being shaped by them for so long that the beginning of it is invisible, and the end of it is unimaginable. This is what the story of 1666 is really about. Not the fire, not the architecture, not the specific question of what was there before and what is there now. It is about the depth of human time at a specific place, about the way a landscape accumulates meaning, the way a palimpsest accumulates writing, about the specific human need to mark, to measure, to orient, to encode in stone or earth or word the recognition that we are here, in this place, and the place is more than we can see. The fire burned what was built, the place remains, and somewhere beneath the dome, beneath the foundations, beneath the ox skulls and the Roman altars, and the layers going down through 4,000 years of human presence, the original thing, the thing that made the first person choose this hill, this river, this bend, is still there, unchanged, unburnable, patient as only something measured in geological time can be patient, not waiting to be discovered, not hidden, just there. The way the river is there, the way the hill is there, the way the specific quality of light on an equinox morning, moving along the axis of the nave of a cathedral, built on top of a pagan temple, built on top of something older still, connects 300 years to 3,000 to 30,000 in a single moment. The fire was 4 days in September 1666. The place is 4,000 years and counting. That is what they built on top of. That is what is still underneath. That is the London that never burned. If you are still here, still listening, still following this thread down through the layers, then you already know what it means to pay that kind of attention. The kind that does not flinch from the deep time. The kind that can sit with a question that has no clean answer and find the sitting worthwhile. You can tap like if this kind of depth is something you want more of. It takes a long time to make something like this, and knowing it reaches people who are ready to go. This deep makes it worth the time. Subscribe if you want to be here when we go down the next layer. There are always more layers. There is always something older underneath. And leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is there. Tell me what the light is doing outside your window right now. Because the whole point of all of this, the fire and the rebuilding and the mounds and the rivers and the stone in the wall on Cannon Street, is that we are all here, at our own bends of our own rivers, part of the same long presence, connected by the same impulse, to mark and to understand and to carry forward what we can. The fire burned the buildings, we are still here. Good night, good morning. Whatever it is where you are, the place endures.